As all of you are aware, SOFX Treasury Foundation is a unique coming together of FX professionals who had been trained at a PSU bank 3 decades back. Since the foundation started its journey a year ago, we have been extensively involved in knowledge sharing through a number of training programs for the tertiary professionals, besides the daily market briefings as well as the weekly briefings. We have been organizing webinars on various topics of interest. Thought leaders from across the globe have participated in these webinars and interacted with predominantly an Indian treasury audience. Capital account convertibility is one topic which always found headlines, but had never been explained beyond that in the last 30 years. Since the recent speech by the Deputy Governor, the topic had once again engaged the attention of the markets. We thought it would be appropriate to discuss the concept in detail and examine the pros and cons. It is our privilege that we have eminent speakers to guide us through the discussion. I take this opportunity to welcome Srimati Usha Thorat, former Deputy Governor, RBI. She had been instrumental in so many policy steps that brought enormous dividends for the economy. No doubt, CSE has been her interest, and I am sure her opening remarks would set the tone for the discussions this evening. It is my pleasure to welcome three eminent speakers of the evening. Sri Tirthankar Patnaik, Chief Economist, NSE, Sri Rahul Bajoria, Chief Economist, Barclays Investment Bank, and Srimati Madhavi Arora, Lead Economist, MK Global Financial Services. I am sure that their views on the subject will definitely help all of us to have full knowledge about the concept. Once again, I welcome all of you, and I hand over the podium to you, Venkatraman, for anchoring the proceedings. Thank you.
Good evening to all of you. I have great pleasure in introducing Ms. Usha Thorat, whom all of us are very eager to hear her. Usha Thorat served as the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India from 10th November 2005 to 8th November 2010. As a Deputy Governor, she handled multiple responsibilities and successfully steered the economy through the global financial crisis of 2008. Post-retirement, she has been involved in various committees relating to the banking sector and financial markets. Ladies and gentlemen, NSE of India Limited and SOFX Treasury Foundation are pleased to present the one and only Ms. Usha Thorat for her opening remarks on this program. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Venkat, for that. I cannot claim any uniqueness in whatever I've done, and it's thank you very much, SY Foundation and NSE for inviting me. It's nice to see Rahul and Tirthankar, whom I've been reading only, and seeing you face. And Madhvi, I'm sorry I'm not able to hang on for your talks. I would very much have loved to do that, but I've got some commitments which are there for long before. But I couldn't resist the idea of sharing my thoughts at this topic because 1997, the Tarapur Committee 1 submitted its report. 96, 97, I was involved as acting as secretary to that committee and interacting with many of them. And of course, Michael Patra was there with me at that time. And he's very much in charge in the Reserve Bank these days. So it's interesting to see 14 years ago, we were talking about the path to, greater convertibility. And of course, a subsequent Tarapur committee talked about fuller convertibility. And the discussion and the debate on this subject can never be really over. But it's interesting that in 1995, 96, the received wisdom was really that capital controls are an evil necessity maybe, but very soon countries should remove all financial or controls over financial flows, and that will be good for the economy, it will be good for welfare. And that was what was called the Washington Consensus, and IMF and all were great prominence of that. And that was the context in which the Capital Account Convertibility Committee was set up. But it was soon overtaken by events because the Asian crisis kind of coincided with the submission of the report. So many of the things that were recommended, people started re-examining it. And that's how the subsequent committee was set up, which also talked about, and just like what Governor Das has said, that it is not an event, it's a process. And Ravi has also in his talk talked about the sequential, gradual liberalization of capital controls to do what can be done, which does not pose tremendous risks to the macro and financial stability, and to see what would be in the best advantage of the citizens of the country. So this debate actually goes on, and we have taken many, many steps. I mean, I would say one big step towards, which to my mind is a very big one, is really the FAR. Having access to government securities for all issuances, 5 years, 10 years, and 30 years after in the year 2021, 22, and also to specify certain specified securities for which full access will be available. I think this is a huge step forward. And Ravi, in his, I refer to him as Ravi, I should say Deputy Governor Ravi Shankar, in his recent address to the FEDI, has actually called for a wider debate. So I think it's very good that you're setting off the ball rolling with this particular webinar on certain issues relating to capital account convertibility. And I'm really going to focus on those issues because I think it's good to discuss these issues. As also you could discuss other issues, but I thought these issues I would really flag. At the outset, I would like to just make one point, and that is the preconditions laid down by the Tarapur Committee are still as valid today as they were then. So in other words, countries which higher fiscal deficit and who have really had continuous current account deficits, although there may have been years here and there where you may not have had a current account deficits, and the financial sector cannot be, said to be in the pink of health, there are risks in opening up the capital account too quickly. So the preconditions which Tarapur Committee had about the macro, I think are still valid, for India as for other countries which are similarly placed. And that is the reason why I guess we always call it a process and not an event. And particularly for inflows, opening up too fast, too quick is always been a concern, and that too debt inflows. So reason is that debt inflows are more, vulnerable to sudden stops compared to equity inflows. And that has been proved right from the Mexican crisis, Latin American crisis, Asian crisis. So that plus internationalization. So these two things have always been a kind of an Achilles heel, and people are very careful before stepping into these two areas, which I would say are the really two important areas in the capital account controls, capital controls, which you can be gradual about it. But should you go for the all or nothing approach, or should you have even more an open account? Plus, you also have the impossible trinity, which means that if you want to manage exchange rate and you want to have an open capital account and a managed exchange and an independent monetary policy, it's tricky. So we have to keep that very much in mind. It's not that you cannot. You can probably do a little bit here and a little bit there, but it's always, be having an eye to sterilization, costs of sterilization, risks of sterilization, too large inflows, how to manage inflows, how to manage sudden outflows, and a whole lot of other, a host of issues which comes, the reason for which we really justify the kind of wedge between the domestic money markets and overseas money markets. So I think the Indian approach has served well. It has been sequenced and calibrated, and I think it's rightly called for this discussion which Deputy Governor has raised. I don't want to get into the overall issues. Countries have actually grown without capital account liberalization like China. Other countries which had capital account liberalization have not grown. So let's not get into welfare and a philosophical discussion. I would rather talk very practical on the subjects that we are right now here. Like I mentioned, let me first talk about the FAR and the index, the global bond index. So since 2021, all new issuances in the 5-year, 10-year, and 30-year segments are eligible for investments by FPIs. In additional 5 securities are also at that time were eligible. Currently, the list contains, I think, 11 securities which are available for investment by overseas non-resident investors without any limit. I understand that the current non-resident investments in government securities are around $20 billion, and that's roughly 2% of the entire issuance. Now, if the entire stock becomes eligible, non-residents would hold 10% of the issuance, which would be about $100 billion. So even a small increase from 2% to 10% would mean about $100 billion. Now, the issue has been raised by the Deputy Governor whether the entire issuance should be specified under FAR, should be coterminous when India is included in the global bond index. The reason for that seems to be that if you are included in the global bond index, then many of the investors around the world who are really follow an index are essentially passive investors. So that means a certain percentage of their, the portfolio is dedicated to India bonds, and that will continue to be there. So either you go over or you go under. So you're under the benchmark or you over the benchmark, but then you remain, say, within here or there of the benchmark. So then the global bond index, when it becomes your benchmark and people are gauging your performance vis-a-vis benchmark, then there would not be too much instability in the flows. That is the underlying assumption. That so this is again a matter that you people who are in the markets would know better, whether these kind of funds, pension funds, insurance funds, many other funds, are they really more stable? And then therefore what is not stated is that if you just have the access to rupee securities, Government of India rupee securities completely open for non-residents, they could be capricious inflows and outflows. Whereas if you make it coterminous with the global bond index, then you probably would not have the risks of sudden stops and sudden volatile flows is minimized. It's never ever eliminated. It is minimized. So this is the issue that I think Ravi has very correctly raised. Now, the point is, let us first look at the issue, and this is what I would like you to discuss: whether the entire issuance and the existing stock should be eligible for FAR. Now, given the macro fundamentals of India, namely the fiscal deficit and current account deficit as a normal trend, there is always that the risk of inflation in India is higher than global inflation. So Indian inflation is higher than global inflation. Indian absolute interest rates and yields are higher than global yields. And if you look at certain periods, even in dollar terms, the bond yields are perhaps higher than some of the global yields. So there is the risk of attracting the flows, because just because you're investing in a 30-year bond doesn't mean you're locked in for 30 years. Especially if you're trying to impart liquidity to the 30-year bond, and if you're trying to impart liquidity to the 10-year bond and the 5-year bond being benchmark bonds, and you want people to be really, have that kind of facility of entering and exiting, then clearly indices which also follow those benchmark bonds, you're going to find that it can be quite volatile and affect that. And therefore, if you start then targeting yields and keeping yields stable, then it is completely inconsistent with this approach. So I think one has to be sure that when you are allowing overseas investors to come and invest in 5-year, 10-year, and 30-year benchmark bonds, and you are imparting a lot of liquidity to that part of the yield curve, and that is both to ensure that domestic markets develop, you're also making it easier for entry and exit for the foreign investors. So there will be more volatility, and there is, because the yields are higher than global yields, there is the whole carry story which will work itself out. So I think there is a risk of this risk really needs to be examined, and what the benefits are and the risks are, and they have to be examined. Now, coming to the benefits, I'll come to that in a minute. But I'm only now pointing out the risks. The other risk that we somehow have in this country is that we are also we write put options, the Reserve Bank. So on the exchange rate, on the yields. So then the famous Greenspan put can become an India bond put, with both exchange rates and yields being, managed. And that could give a money for jam condition for global investors. So we need to discuss this. We need to be very clear that we are going into it with our eyes really open. So this is the first point I really want to make, and I think let me now come to the other discussion. Let me also accept the fact that I may be like Rip Van Winkle. You know, I have been sleeping maybe for 14 years or 12 years or whatever it is, and maybe today the world isn't what I had thought. But I thought 2013 is only what? 2013 is only 7 years ago, right? $4 billion in 1 month, and we got panicked. And so just don't, we should all not forget. I don't think it's so long ago. So maybe I maybe even if I had been sleeping till then, after that, it's not such a long time. So this is why I hope we take a careful and cautious view before the entire GSEC's issuance and stock is open for investment. The second issue, which the Deputy Governor flagged, is about allowing non-residents to hold rupee accounts. To quote, this will be an important early step in internationalization of the rupee and therefore needs to be carefully considered. Further, there is a need to consider a proper mechanism for information flow so that exchange rate and interest rate management can continue to be effective in an environment of larger offshore transactions. It's a loaded statement, and you can really dissect it and debate it. It is true that China moved towards liberalization by allowing foreigners to hold their renminbi. So they really want to internationalize the renminbi. In India's case, let's look at China. China operated from a position of current account surpluses, fiscal surpluses. And they needed people to buy their goods, and they needed people to have liquidity to buy their goods. And people were all trade surplus with them. So it is good that they could have renminbi accounts because automatically the renminbi will be used to buy Chinese goods. So we have to think about it in the terms of the real sector. Whereas we are both growing from a fiscal deficit and a current account deficit, kind of a normal situation. Plus, we have to talk about our financial sector's vulnerability. Let us examine this issue a little more. Are we talking about allowing non-residents to hold rupee accounts in Indian banks? Are we visualizing Indian banks growing their balance sheets with savings from non-residents? Are we saying that the problem we are facing is of shortage of savings for investment? I'm talking about the macro problem. Are we saying that we are facing a shortage of savings for investment and that domestic savings is limited and hence we need foreign savings? It is true that savings have gone down recently, but this is more on account of incomes going down, GDP going down, and households borrowing more. People have been borrowing and spending because they haven't had incomes. So therefore, savings have been going down. And does it mean that the only way the economy can now grow is to borrow from abroad? That means more foreign savings. To a certain extent, it is true. History shows us that up to 2%, 3% current account deficit, which is the same as foreign savings. The equations work out that way. So that is something that India needs to have, that kind of a growth. But beyond 3% is current account deficit, it starts getting into problems. And then you also have the issues of exchange rate competitiveness, so there is a whole lot of issues which are all linked. We have to look at debt servicing capacities. We have to look at our export surplus. The potential for us to keep on borrowing, but to ensure that debt servicing is kept within certain limits. And these are variables which are as true 14 years ago as they are true now. These are variables we need to carefully monitor as a country before we resort to greater borrowing from abroad, whichever way, either by having more, allowing foreigners to have rupee accounts in India, which is also like a borrowing, or to have, more access to government securities, which is also a borrowing, or to issue rupee bonds outside the country, which is also borrowing, or to issue a dollar bond, which is also borrowing, or to just do ECBs. All of it together has to be seen whether it's sustainable. So the macro-prudential way of looking at it, looking at the risks, the benefits clearly are more foreign savings to facilitate better growth. Simple. But what other risks if you do particularly this particular way? And what is keeping domestic savings down? We cannot look at one without looking at the other. So that is what I thought. I'll talk about the basic point, the two basic points that he has raised. The third point was about integration between overseas markets and domestic markets. Again, to quote, allowing Indian banks access to NDF markets for the rupee, he remarked, is also consistent with this objective. As government securities get held by global custodians and trade, for these measures are already seeing the desired results. NDF onshore spreads have substantially narrowed after allowing Indian banks into the NDF space. As you all very well know, the committee that I headed on offshore markets tried to say, let's simplify the rules onshore. Let's get the market locally. And for that, let's remove all these kind of documentary requirements here. And we can just do the monitoring through an AI-based thing, through the legal entity identifier, and try to use that to see whether any controls need to be brought in, but rather than having no onerous documentary requirements. And let's facilitate global custody to link with the domestic clearing and settlement system. And let's also offer custodial arrangements for global investors. Let's give the benefit, and I remember mentioning this to you in the Forex Association, let's give the benefit of the finer spreads we have in our domestic markets to people genuinely taking an rupee exposure in India. People like Apple, Amazon, all the kind of real market participants, let's try to get them rather than our banks going and operating in the NDF market offshore. And that was one reason why the committee did not recommend actually allowing Indian banks to go overseas. We said, first, let's get the market here and then let's look at this. So I think we also made a number of recommendations of removing some of those documentary requirements for operating in the Indian foreign exchange markets, where all of you have been stalwarts. And you know that you can make this market, you can market this, timing difference, quoting round the clock, carrying positions around the world, all that can do. In fact, Abhi has mentioned about the retail platform, and I think banks have to actively market that. Today, technology will soon break it and banks will be bypassed, as we have seen in other areas. So it's much better that banks make their, everything accessible, give the benefit of spreads, give the benefit of volumes, and then, make, even if it is a very, very marginal margins, if one has to say that. The other last point was, which the DG referred to, was about the liberalized remittance scheme. It is a very fine scheme, $25,000 per annum, mostly sufficient for an individual's requirements. So all the hassles of getting foreign exchange, this, that, are literally not there today ever since this scheme was introduced. Perhaps the outflows under the scheme have increased. And therefore, that could be maybe that people feel there are capital outflows in the guise of, current account transactions, whatever it is. So I feel that this is really a scheme which eased transactions for residents. And maybe the concerns have also brought in, there is a TCS, tax collected at source now, on these transactions. So and that is actually, you have to claim it back. So we just, our whole process of liberalization has been remove hassles. Why are we creating more hassles? So I finally end with this thing, where there is a good scheme going, what is our concern about it? Okay, you want to use that scheme to start up a business outside, but this is a personal, for individuals. For businesses, let's look at something else. Let's just talk about a simple scheme. Let us leave it simple with minimum hassles. And let's look at the bigger picture of, whether we really are wanting to get more foreign borrowing, more foreign savings for supporting domestic savings. And that more or less is a question of a relative assessment of the external debt servicing capacity of this country on a longer term basis. So with that, I would just conclude my opening thoughts, which I felt like sharing with you all. I would love to hear your response.
Thank you very much. It has always been a pleasure to listen to you. You have nicely traced the history of the CSE right from the year 95, 96 and 97, where you were the secretary of the committee. And you have rightly highlighted the issues concerning that. Well, I'm sure you are not the Rupee being killed. You are the voice to be heard and respected in the markets. And definitely, I think the regulators will listen to what are all the issues you have raised especially on the global bond index opening up to the FII and 100% and allowing NRI to hold the rupee account, what are the risks, and the integration of the markets, non-resident holding the rupee accounts, and finally on the LRS scheme, the tax collected at source. So you have been as frank as ever, and thank you very much for sparing your time and addressing it at a very short notice. And we have been immensely benefited, and we will continue to draw your expertise in our future programs. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Pritankar and Madhvi. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure in introducing Sri Rahul Bajoria. Rahul Bajoria is a masterate in economics from the National University of Singapore and is currently the chief economist with Barclays Investment Bank, Mumbai. Prior to this assignment, he has been working as a senior regional economist with Asia Pacific with Barclays. He has authored so many books. A recent book, The Story of Reserve Bank of India, is a must read for all the market participants as it captures the essence of monetary policy making at the ministry. He would be speaking about the international experiences and history of capital account convertibility in the Indian context. Over to you, Raju.
Thank you, Mr. Venkatraman. Absolute pleasure to be here at the foundation, and thanks to NSE for organizing this. As always, it was very educational to listen to Madam Thorat, talk about her experiences, and I would echo the point that she's not the Rip Van Winkle. I mean, she's literally spent designing the entire process of capital account liberalization in India, and so she, having spent so much time in the trenches, her points were absolutely spot on, I thought, and I pretty much share, some of the concerns that she raised. What I thought I would do in my, 15, 20 minutes or so was to provide some more historical context of, how India has sort of thought about capital account convertibility, not just in the last 30 years, but also maybe try to take a slightly longer view of how, our capital account came to be so restrictive, and, why does it have to be liberalized in a gradual but a consistent manner. But also look at some numbers of what are the challenges of going about liberalizing the capital account, and, why we have had a bit of a stop-start approach over the last 3 decades or so. So maybe I'll just share my screen. I have a small presentation. So I mean, just to maybe start off and provide some historical context of how India has approached this. I think there really have been three broad parts in which India has sort of looked at foreign investment uh, as both either a source of growth. Then we had a period where we looked at it with a lot of suspicion, and the entire system, which still to an extent prevails till this date, of around a scarcity mentality around foreign exchange was brought in, and then post 1991, we have had sort of a calibrated liberalization. But coming into the independence, when India became independent in 1947, India had a very unique situation compared to other emerging countries, which were getting in the post-colonial backdrop, that India had actually a very good balance of payments position. Historically, because India was exporting a lot of goods to the Western countries, in particular Great Britain. We used to run current account surpluses, and in those days, it was the sterling area, so our holdings were mostly in sterling. But it was basically IOUs that the Bank of England would sign, and that basically became the edifice on which the entire planning process of pursuing industrialized growth kind of came about, right? So it was sort of managing our foreign resources, and trying to get more foreign investment. So whether it was, say, in the field of education, field of power generation, etc., we did get quite a bit of foreign support. Some of it was foreign aid, some of it was outright investment, but there was a fairly liberalized environment for the first 15, 20 years that India was pursuing its initial growth strategy. And that was a period also when we did not have such difficulty in terms of financing our current account deficit. Now the situation changed with the droughts that affected India. Multiple rounds of droughts came through, and it was also the time when India had fought multiple wars, right? So between 1962 and 1971, we fought three wars. So in less than 10 years, you're fighting three wars. The geopolitical environment around you has changed. And so coming into the first oil shock, 1973, when the Yom Kippur War kicked off and oil prices went up, India had a very difficult time at that point, both politically and also economically. We went through a period of very high inflation, and this was the year when the FERA, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, was enacted, and the whole notion of managing your foreign exchange became very, very important, right? Because we had a very difficult time before that, and India had to go to the IMF and the World Bank to get aid all the time. And so the political environment at that point was one where the scarcity mindset became very deep seated. Now, a lot of it started getting rolled back very quickly. So as early as 1976, 77, when after the collapse of the gold standard, we had the depegging of the currency sterling, towards the dollar. We moved to a new way of setting exchange rates. But also there was a recognition that you need to allow more foreign participation, or at least some selective foreign participation. So you had non-resident Indians being allowed to open deposit accounts in our banks, in local banks. And that kind of process continued, through the early 80s and late 80s, when a lot more access was provided to foreign banks, foreign investors to come and start investing in India, but on a very short term, very selective basis, right? So effectively, the fears of having say a liberalized capital account, or liberalized investments coming into the picture, and that money basically going back effectively crystallized, and that is what led to the 91 crisis, right? I mean, the whole pullback in short term capital inflows is what basically triggered the entire shock. Now, in terms of the post 91 landscape, right? I mean, obviously, the reforms, even though there was the devaluation, the double devaluation of the currency, it was actually the industrial side which got really reformed. And as far as India was concerned, from a BOP standpoint, it actually took about a good 3 years since the since the 91 event itself for India to accept all the conditions of having full convertibility on the current account, right? So before that, even current account transactions were largely restricted. And so it was only in 94 that India acceded to the Article 7 of the IMF Charter, which was to completely remove restrictions on current account transactions. So effectively, you could, have foreign exchange available to you, technically speaking, if you are going out of the country, or you want to buy something. And a lot of that was happening simultaneously with the industrial reforms of reducing import tariffs, reducing restrictions on, say, private banks were allowed to come back in. And there were two major committees, so Madam Thorat referred to, the Tarapur committee of 96, 97, a very seminal committee, which gave very large scale recommendations on how to improve India's external position, through capital account convertibility being, a source of capital for the country. But before that, even the Sudhani committee, which was there in 1995, made some pretty important recommendations on financial institutions. And this was all coming in the backdrop of the Narsimhan committees. So the Narsimhan 1 committee had made very large scale recommendations about financial sector liberalization, and both the Sudhani and the Tarapur committee came, in the wake of those two committees. And this was also the time when Dr. Rangarajan, and followed by him, Dr. Jalan, had that reformist instinct, right? So there was a good collaboration between the government and the RBI in order to pursue these objectives. Now, unfortunately, as Madam Thorat mentioned, we had the Asian crisis shock, and India too had its own problems, through the period of, say, political turbulence within the country. We had the nuclear tests, which basically triggered sanctions. And so India had to basically do a lot of jugglery in terms of, managing its external positions. But after the 1999 Kargil incident, right, Kargil war, there was again a bit of mojo that came back on this particular issue, and quite a bit of external liberalization took place. So we started allowing FIIs to come and start investing in our markets, both equities and debt. It was very restrictive on the debt side, but at least on the equity side, it was there. And in 2003, 2004, the big change came about when we basically allowed ECB issuances to pick up. And so that was the point at which both our current account and capital account were in a surplus, and so we had very active increase in our foreign inflows and foreign reserves. Now that effectively set the tone for the second Tarapur committee to sit, and this was also in conjunction with two other committees. So there was the Percy Mistry committee on the International Financial Center. How do you make Mumbai an international financial center? And there was the Raghuram Rajan committee on larger financial sector reforms, that were to be pursued. The RBI was not looking favorably at both of those committees, but they were also there. So the idea was that, some mojo was again coming back on the whole discussion about pursuing capital account convertibility. And unfortunately, again, at that point, the GFC hit, right? So a lot of the momentum of liberalizing, both from an inflows and also at that point from an outflows perspective, allowing Indian residents to invest more abroad, was kind of lost because of, we had a bit of a shock. We saw quite a bit of capital going out. And so naturally, the instinct at that point, given the macroeconomic situation of high inflation, large fiscal deficits, so, the preconditions not being met, were basically led to a situation where you had a lot of this momentum lost. But because we had very high financing requirements, quite a few small changes, like say the deregulation of interest rates of how do banks, offer to what non-residents or residents, that was removed because we needed financing. Similarly, a lot of FII investment was allowed in the bond side. At that point, it used to come in clips of $5 billion that the then finance minister, late Pranab Mukherjee, would come and announce every now and then. And a lot of that momentum again kind of got lost when we had the taper tantrum issue, right? So as ma'am was saying, 7 years back, and it has had a profound impact in the way the RBI thinks about managing inflation and managing the external side. But effectively, the entire focus, since post the taper tantrum episode, and we have had some liberalization as well, has been on trying to get foreign investors to basically participate more in rupee denominated assets rather than foreign exchange denominated assets. And I think the idea is simple, that we control the value of the rupee to a certain extent, and the impact on debt servicing, impact on financial institutions is much lesser when it is in rupees rather than if it was a dollar liability or any other foreign exchange liability. And so a lot of the push towards capital account convertibility in India in the last 5 years has been coming in the wake of trying to basically get people to take more rupee exposure. And I think this is inherently a very smart strategy from the RBI side, right? Because clearly, if we look at the intervention behavior, the RBI has been very interventionist in the last 7 years or so, and there have been periods where, there have been more interventionists, there have been less interventionists, the magnitude differs. But broadly speaking, there is an acceptance within the institution that, we need to have insurance, that we, even if we are running a relatively high current account deficit, or even if we run a small current account deficit, the cover ratios should be good because you don't want to go through a taper tantrum like episode. But some of the bigger challenges, and this is something that Madam Thorat attributed to as well, is that the biggest challenge for India in some senses, and this can also be a benefit, and I'll come to that how it could be, is that India basically does not run current account surpluses, right? So a lot of our capital or reserve accumulation is a function of the extra capital we are getting over and above our current account financing requirements, right? So if we are letting so much of current account financing money go out of the system, we will basically have to get more capital in order to, continue to do this liberalization. And to me, capital account liberalization is not a one-way street. It is basically allowing both foreign or non-residents and residents equal access to take money in or out of the country, right? And what we technically have is that our capital account is almost fully convertible for non-resident investors, because they are not prevented from taking money out. Yes, there might be some regulations, but there is no prevention, rule for them not to take money out. They can take it out very easily. Where the restrictions are probably the biggest is actually on domestic residents, residents from taking money out. And that is where the liberalization to me becomes very punchy. If we allow for that fungibility of capital to kick in, but it will inherently be difficult because we run a current account deficit. So there will always be this start and stop issue as far as the convertibility discussion is concerned. And that's why we have had these periods where the discussion picks up when we have very good foreign reserves, or we have had large inflows and sterilization costs and cost of holding foreign reserves becomes an issue. But the moment we have outflows, a lot of that discussion kind of dials down, and this is not uncommon. This is very similar to experiences of other large countries which also run current account deficits, right? And so this is a reality that we have to basically live with. But still, we have had outflows of capital increase over the last few years. And effectively, if you look at the stock level, it is still low. But then the numbers are increasing, and they are increasing both through a combination of LRS schemes, through more, participation of Indian companies into, turning into multinationals and having more presence in other parts of the world. And also, very slowly, but surely there's been some increase in uh, portfolio investments as well out of India into the global markets, and this is an opportunity, right? Because ultimately global returns are also pretty good, and India holding on to very large reserves. Effectively, the opportunity cost is very high for us to hold those reserves, and we have quantified this recently. We effectively lose about 1 to 1.5% of GDP every year by holding such large reserves. So we need to make sure that the insurance we pay for keeping our currency stable is actually worth it, right? So, and that's effectively a policy call that keeps coming about. But certainly there's a need to think of it from that perspective. Now, one discussion which I find very fascinating whenever this comes in is that we always have this issue of Tobin tax being discussed in the context of whenever we have large capital inflows, there's also the temptation to put Tobin tax or some kind of a transaction tax, because you see foreign investors obviously making good returns. And my overall hunch is that, in India, obviously, we don't have any issues as far as convertibility is concerned. As I said, for foreign investors, India's capital account is pretty much fully convertible. It's only the resident investors who have convertibility issues, and there's a lot of scrutiny and a lot of paperwork that needs to come through. But in a way, this will be an ongoing debate. I think the history tells us that India will basically have to find ways of thinking about being innovative as far as our convertibility is concerned. The fact that we run a current account deficit, actually can be an advantage rather than a difficulty in this pursuing this objective of capital account convertibility. Because if we can convince foreign investors or non-residents to hold the rupee, right, rather than we getting more dollars, we convince them to hold more rupees. They still owe us, so our NIP improves irrespective. And the fact that we run a current account deficit does give us some opportunity that as the country grows, so we had done a very simple back of the envelope calculation that based on projected GDP levels, India's current account cumulatively over the next 10 years could be anywhere between $800 billion to about $1 trillion, right? So that's the amount of money we might be pumping into the global economy over the next 10 years. Now, could we get some of that exposure in rupee, right? How do we convince people to hold more rupees in those? So effectively, you make rupee a hard currency. And there, the preconditions that ma'am spoke about of having a sustainable fiscal deficit, having a low and manageable current account deficit becomes very important. So we go back to the Tarapur Committee of 1996-97 of making sure that those preconditions are there. But I think India does have an opportunity here. This is a debate that needs to happen more frequently. And we can make the currency rupee a hard currency, but for that we do need to show those macro preconditions being satisfied on a very consistent basis. So this is a policy challenge that is something that we all are trying to push through, at least as far as the policy making discussion dialogue is concerned. So maybe with that, I think I'm coming up on my time. I'll pass it back to Mr. Venkatraman. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Rajul, for the very interesting presentation. Now I know why Madam Thorat referred that I'm sorry I'm missing your presentation. So you have nicely traced the historical context from 60 to 71. What I loved was the landmark events, what you have nicely put up from 2007 to 2021. I like the comment that the current account deficit, in contrast research, they are the best for the country at the moment. So I'm sure that the current CID deficit will be an advantage, and there was a discussion on Tobin tax. So altogether, it was a very completely an interesting talk. My request to the participants who are all in this program, they may please put in their questions on the chat box so that after the speaker session is over, we will have a short question and answer session. And I thank Rajul for this interesting presentation. Now I go on to introduce Dr. Tirthankar Patnaik. Tirthankar Patnaik has 21 years of experience in Indian capital markets, macro and sector strategy, quantitative finance, consumer banking analytics, corporate finance, consumer analytics, and financial econometrics. Wow. He has masters in statistics from University of Madras and has a doctorate from IGI Mumbai, where his area of research was high frequency finance and market microstructure. He is the chief economist with the NSE of India Limited. Prior to this, he had been working as an India equity strategist in a multinational bank and as a chief economist in an institutional equities and investment banking company. He will be sharing with us his perspective about capital account convertibility from the Indian context. Over to you, Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Coming after Madam Thorat and coming after Rahul's exposition is like, I don't know, at the last moment of the scene, this is when in a movie, when the credits are just rolling in, you've already seen the climax, you've already seen the movie. But I will try and put like a Disney movie, they put these Christmas eggs at the end where you still see a scene, the audience waits and, sees if something interesting can come up. So with that attitude, I will try and put in something that has not been discussed. I will move through my presentation quickly in the interest of time, but I'll spend some time on the slides where our discussion has not taken forth for now. Let me try and share the slide, please. Thank you. So I suppose, Madam Thorat spoke about the discussion by Deputy Governor Ravi Shankar and the points that he raised in his speech of October 14th that has brought in the discussion on is India ready for capital account convertibility and what are the challenges that we would face, if we move towards that venture. And one of the points that she made was it's a process and not an event, and that has to be seen in both the Deputy Governor's speeches and Madam's comments as well. Rahul gave us an idea about how we came to this position in terms of our capital position right after independence and how macro position forced us to have much tighter controls on capital. So today, however, we are in a situation where the macro situation, the external position especially, seems far better. All these charts are well known to the audience. So we have a recovery happening on our economy in terms of national income. The average inflation numbers have started coming off. This is contrary to what's happening with the rest of the world. It was surprising actually and quite nice to see the central bank actually reduce their inflation expectations from the year from 5.7% to 5.3% in their last policy. The question, of course, is how long will that sort of continue? Over the current account balance, we've had a couple of good years, and now with that we have this situation. We have forex reserves which have touched lifetime highs, and as Rahul pointed out, the question is the cost that we have for these reserves. How do we actually effectively deploy them? There was even an RBI bulletin paper this time, which essentially spoke about various methods that could be explored, various avenues that could be explored in terms of deployment of forex reserves. And what was very interesting was gold ETFs were considered, equity ETFs were also considered, S&P 500 ETFs, in terms of potential deployments of FX reserves. My point to this is this slide. One should see from a very simple perspective that the accretion to our FX reserves has happened from the capital account. It is not from the current account. One of the things Madam spoke about, Madam Thorat spoke about, Rahul also spoke about, in terms of from a current account perspective, it is very important to keep our current account deficit under control at this point. But we should understand that this accretion to our forex reserves has come from a rise in the capital account, and that has led to the BOP net inflows that we see this year. Last year we saw about $99 billion added to our FX reserves, which gives us this. I know Rahul also spoke about it a little bit. our international investment position, regardless of our $640 billion of FX reserves, is still in the negative. So, to the rest of the world, India is a debtor country. India remains a debtor country. And while, if you see the numbers of last year, the rise in our FX reserves made it marginally better in terms of the net international investment position, but we remain fairly, we remain big debtors to the world. And this point needs to be kept in mind when we see our, somewhat comfortable forex reserves. From here, I need to, give a quote here. So, Madam Thorat spoke about how the IMF has been, supportive of liberalization, how capital account convertibility was an idea that was considered in the early 90s, and how situations, therefore, thereafter changed, and which led to, this, this idea not being really fructified. However, if you see an institutional view paper from IMF in 2012, they say that there's no presumption that full liberalization is an appropriate goal for all countries and all times. And it is with this view I would like to go to the next slide, where I promised I will have an Easter egg here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this chart. So this essentially tells you how our capital account has actually behaved in terms of being liberalized or not. So we have had this discussion of liberalizing the capital account. The discussion started quite a while back, and and we've also discussed through this program what led to various changes in them. So what we are actually doing here is we are taking a step further from Madam Thorat's comment that the movement towards full capital convertibility is a process and not an event. So what we are seeing here is, is as an excerpt from Agarwal et al.'s paper in 2021, where they essentially look at these are deviations from covered interest parity. So to this audience, covered interest parity should be fairly known. So, covered interest parity essentially says that your interest rates, your domestic and foreign interest rates are linked in equilibrium with the spot exchange rate and the forward exchange rate. So what Agarwal and al. Have done in this paper is basically try to see what does the the implied forward rate turn out to be, and they have then compared it with what is the actual NDF, 1 month NDF. So as they show in this chart, you have several Roman letters. Let me just explain that in a bit. What you're seeing here are the annual deviations from covered interest parity. Now, if you have full capital convertibility, then your covered interest parity deviation will be very close to zero. If it is not, and if you are deviating away, and this happens with if you impose capital accounts, capital controls, when that happens, you deviate away from covered interest parity. Now, what you see here as stages 1, 2, 3, 4, part of it at least has to be seen in Rahul's presentation. I believe it started from 2007 to 2020. Here, Agarwal et al. Have taken it from 1999 to Jan 2021. And the periods that you're seeing here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are not really imposed. What they are done is, it is what we call in econometrics is an endogenously identified regime shift. So, we can actually say that, let's see what happened after Raghuram Rajan came in, pre-Raghuram Rajan, taper tantrum. So these are exogenously specified. What we are doing here is the data is endogenously identifying what are clear regime shifts in that period. Okay. So I will discuss each of these periods. So what you can quickly see here is there are periods, between 2005 and 2010 here, which is period 3, where you have had a huge amount of deviation from covered interest parity. And as you go after 2015, these deviations have sort of died down. And this data essentially goes all the way till January 2021. So I just wanted to spend some time on what happened here in these 6 periods that you're seeing here. So in the first period, given the deviation from the capital account, I mean, the column that you should see here is the one that I have put in, in the red rectangle. A 3% annualized deviation from covered interest parity, and with the standard deviation of 3.24, essentially means you had huge deviations from CIP. So this discussion, I have given the link here, so it is available for everyone to read. So this essentially showed that you had pretty tight controls on your, capital account. This was the period right after the, nuclear weapons. We had, sanctions from the US. So that period was about, between 99 and 2002. Between 2002 and 2005, notice what happens to the CIP deviation. It falls substantially. So from minus 3.73, it goes to about 0.25. That actually shows, you started having financial integration, things started looking back up, and then things went back down during the global financial crisis. So between 2005 and 2009, you see a sharp, it's almost going, harking back to the 99-2002 period. So you had again very hard deviations from covered interest parity. This was about as far as we could go. So there were a couple of things that were happening here. There was GFC volatility. There were controls on outflow of capital because things were quite negative, and there were relaxations at the same time on inflow of capital. So all this led to a significant deviation from CIP. And then you had a relatively calm period between 2009 when the recovery happened. You had quantitative easing globally, low deviation, capital accounts were slowly opened up. So you notice that the CIP deviation drops substantially again. But there was high standard deviation. Notice that it's about 3.96, still meaningful. So this was the aftermath of the GFC. And then, but notice this, towards the end of this period, we are into the taper tantrum. So taper tantrum was mid 2013. Madam Thorat was right. It is only 8 years away. Madam Thorat was again right that the conditions then have not really changed. The variables that need to be seen remain important as ever. So towards the end of this period is where you entered into 2014, and then the lagged impact of the taper tantrum is what we are seeing between 2014 and 18. Lest we get questions, natural questions as to why I have taken 5 years at some point, 4 years at some other point. Notice the number of days keeps changing. The reason is that these are endogenously identified structural breaks. So what it means is this regime shift is something that the data is telling you has happened with covered interest parity. We are not putting any kind of bias in terms of determining these as the period. So after that, if you notice, after 2018, the deviation has dropped down substantially. After 2018, the last 3 years, I would suspect that after 20th Jan 2021, if you extend this data all the way till October of 2021, the mean CIP deviation will remain quite low. And this naturally brings us towards discussion of, are we ready now to go towards CIC? So if you put in some sense, Governor Ravi Shankar, Deputy Governor Ravi Shankar's address, so you're seeing this address coming in October 2021, where you have an extended period. You've had an extended period of relative calm on the CIP. There have been hardly any deviations from covered interest parity. Indian markets are integrating meaningfully. So this is where we have sort of come. I just wanted to show you this chart and how these 5 segments of time over the last 21 years are telling us how we have gone, empirically speaking, with capital account convertibility and away from capital account convertibility. I will leave this. I mean, my question again is the same question that Madam Thorat asked. Are we really ready? So I'll leave that question for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patnaik, for a very exciting presentation. When you put the first slide, are we ready? So I thought you are going on a different note, but then you nicely listed out the macro fundamentals and gave the importance of them, then came to FX reserves and highlighted how the FDI and FPI flows are contributing to that. And what was very much exciting for me personally, I shared with the audience also, the annual deviation from the covered interest parity, what you explained, it was a revelation for most of us who don't look at the financial econometrics in this context. So the summary, what you have given rightly answers that this is the time and we should move towards that. So it's very interesting, and thank you very much for giving the perspective on the Indian context on the capital account convertibility. One again, a request to the participants, you can toss in the questions in the chat box so that after the speaker session is over, we'll have a question and session. Now I have great pleasure in introducing Madhavi Arora. Madhavi Arora is the lead economist at Emkay Global Institutional Equities Desk. She gets the macro research for India and major developed and emerging nations with special focus on FX and rates and asset allocation strategies. She has over 10 years of this experience as a macroeconomist with reputed banks and brokerages. She also played a pivotal role during formulation of the 11th five-year plan with the Planning Commission and shared space with eminent economists and policymakers. She has been ranked as the top India growth forecaster economist and one of the top 3 women economists in India by the Bloomberg. Hearty congratulations to you, madam. Madhavi would be sharing her views on implications of capital account convertibility on the banking sector. Over to you, Madhavi.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much, Venkat sir, for this lovely introduction. Well, Rahul and Tirthankar have already given a fair amount of assessment on the history and the state of CAC. So my apologies if I'm going to sound a bit repetitive in my arguments. Well, to start with, we've had the details of discussions on what CAC is. Country trade with each other. Those transactions are recorded in the BOP, which are classified under 2 accounts, as one understands: the current account, which essentially is export and imports and goods and services, remittances and so on, and the capital account transaction, which comprises inflows, outflows of investment, which could take in the the form of either investments of direct form or via the financial markets. So in the economic parlance, the fair price of the Pareto optimal state will imply that both type of convertibility lead to higher and more efficient trade in goods and services, and in finance or even the financial asset classes in general, which eventually should lead to higher growth for all economies involved. Now you have advantages like unrestricted mobility of capital, improved access to the global financial market in general, and ability to invest abroad easily. All of this, essentially argue for an efficient global capital allocation. While India has been fully convertible in the capital current account bit, as we've been talking, that the debate with regard to the capital account continues to divide markets and policymakers alike. The wishful thinking is that since the 90s, India has been dragging its feet with regard to the capital account convertibility, with each mini crisis or a mega crisis, be it global or local, since the 90s, have been pushing us, one step behind on the progress, both in regulatory terms as on economic health term, but only to optimistically look forward to make new progress in general. Recent crises also indeed have revealed, major shortcomings in the management of foreign debt and liquidity in most emerging markets, and thus one understands why we are still debating the issue of capital account convertibility. After having talked about it, for the past 30 years or so. While we are still away as far as Tarapal Committee recommendations are concerned on associated precondition, especially on the central fiscal deficit account management, wherein he had recommended that FD should be reduced to 3% of GDP, or there should be elimination of revenue deficit, and there should be a surplus building of revenues, surplus of around 1% of GDP before one gets into a full CAC state. There were some mini steps which were taken on that front, and of course the crisis hit us, and we've been moving back and forth as far as FRBM is concerned. So clearly we are way away as far as central FD to GDP ratio coming to 3% is concerned. At this point in time, I think it will be a long run process, but nonetheless, policymakers have taken some mini step, which we have been talking about with regard to how they're now looking to fund their fiscal via the foreign investors route, and which obviously will come with its own cost and benefits. Well, a while ago, Tirthankar as well as Rahul, both argued that we are sitting with a decent pile up of FX reserve, but that necessarily is not something that one can really pride about by saying it's my asset. It's basically your obligation in some form or the other. However, that does not mean that we do not strive to make ways for efficient capital allocation. Let's face it, the country is, indeed capital starved, and I think on net, any kind of efficient capital allocation would be beneficial for the economy. Of course, there will be some risk taking and risk buffering that would come into play as far as those things are concerned. Um, I think needless to say, there have been lessons from the recent crisis as well. If I, go back on dangers of any kind of excessive foreign debt, especially when you see in the context of countries like Argentina, Turkey, or even Indonesia to some extent, particularly when it is short term. On that front, I think India has done sufficient progress. Even if we see the most stringent, ratios like the residual maturity, external debt, as a percentage of GDP or FX reserves has generally remained stable or has lowered over the past 10 years or so. More so, I think the funding of current account deficit has been much more stable over the past few years, with FDI being, one of the dominant, funding source for current account deficit, which also made the basic BOP picture much more healthier than than what it used to be in the past. So basic BOP basically means that I'm essentially removing all the, other sources of financing, which is non-FDI. Even if you see the last year wherein we saw a huge balance of payment surplus of around 90 billion or so, even the basic balance of payment was also a pretty high number of 68 billion. And this is the second consecutive year when we saw a positive BOP and positive basic BOP, entry. And I think even this year also, despite the fact that we would be seeing a current account reversal to probably as high as 1.5% of GDP, depending on where oil settles for the year, we may still see the basic BOP being in the positive territory, especially given the fact that FDI flows looks to be pretty healthy. I think more importantly, other thing with regard to the funding of sovereign is that overall the sovereign debt FI penetration in India has been extremely low. With FI owning merely say around 2% of the outstanding debt, and actually it's now at a tad lower than that, while the max that they're allowed to hold at this point in time is 6%. So again, it clearly shows that the decent amount of underutilization at current level of even when you open up further. When I try to compare India with the EM space, I realize that clearly India is a big outlier. While we can debate that our fiscal health may be different from other countries, but nonetheless, when I see India, even with regard to our sovereign debt in local currencies, sovereign foreign debt in local currencies, the average of emerging market is close to around 18%. It obviously varies from as high as 40 around 40%, 50% for Argentina, 28% for Indonesia, say, and that I'm just including only the local currency debt. If I include the foreign currency debt, wherein India is actually zero at this point in time, the average is again around close to 17-18%. So against that, India's foreign holding is at 2%, looks to be very, very meager. That obviously depicts the fact that we have been pretty cautious on our sovereign funding and opening up to the hot money flows, because that clearly carries a risk of carry and the reversal of the carry that happens whenever there's a wind of change that the global markets see. And as everybody's mentioned, that the experience with full CAC sort of runs in both direction. When times are good, CAC leads to higher capital inflows, which when productively channelized, obviously leads to better economic efficiency and growth. But as the time turns bad, or the wind of change around, we see the same outflows happening and reversal of carry, taking place. So the operating where itself here is that, how do you productively allocate capital? And that becomes a big question as to how you really, see the whole debate of CAC. But needless to say, I think we need the preconditions for availing the CAC benefits in a more comfortable fashion. Does the economy needlessly have to have a decent, strong macroeconomic fundamentals, and more importantly, a well-developed financial system? So I think to that extent, Tarapur preconditions remain pretty much pertinent at this point in time as well. And we need to still develop policies and tools to counter any kind of CAC risk that may come along with the opening up. And as I was discussing any which way, that the hierarchy in terms of how you really see the foreign capital inflows in terms of riskiness has to be probably given priorities to FDI flows being the least risky one, Although very honestly, the most FDI flows that you've seen in the last few years have been more unicorn driven, which again are more PE driven money. So probably will have a risk of reversal, but won't be as volatile as the hot money flows that you may see. And of course, equity investments being the most aggressive one as far as the reversal is concerned. I think the overall debate with regard to CAC or current account convertibility sort of raised up, I think, in 2019 when the finance minister had announced that they are probably even going to try to borrow in foreign currency debt, that is the dollar denominated debt abroad, to finance the fiscal deficit of the government, which obviously opened a Pandora box of debate around, because clearly the distinction between a dollar debt and the local currency debt is that the exchange rate risk has to be managed by the sovereign if at all we issue debt in dollar terms, and clearly this particular issuance is, at least to the narrow prism, is seen as the original sin, as you call in economic parlance, where emerging market economies are forced to borrow in foreign currency because they are unable to issue local currency debt efficiently abroad, and thus it makes them more susceptible to the turmoil in their external account whenever there's any kind of market change in the global taste. In fact, probably one of the reasons why Dr. Reddy has also widely advocated, after this event happened in 2019, that the roadmap towards capital account convertibility with regard to domestic debt is that the sovereign bonds are backloaded, not front-loaded, especially given the fact that when you see a sovereign, it's very different in terms of treatment as versus a non-sovereign debt. It's not a limited liability entity, which obviously means that there is no legally binding debt restructuring mechanism in place at this point in time as far as sovereign debt is concerned. And thus, the treatment will be very different vis-a-vis what you see when corporates go and borrow in dollar terms. I think rightly so, the policymakers finally have held up their decision to raise foreign debt, but and there's still isn't much that has been really dwelled as far as determining the pace and sequencing of CAC is concerned on a formal basis. But nonetheless, I think you are anyway seeing policymakers being open to the idea of foreign investors in a more open fashion with the FAR securities now in order. That essentially has led to the opening of Indian market to global bond indices. I think every year, last 2 years, the FAR securities which have been issued are now essentially around 40% of the total issuance of GSEC that we are seeing. And these FAR securities obviously do not have any limit for investors, which clearly means that over a period of time, if things continue to sort of space up, we will see probably more of foreign investor playing their role around, and that could also imply that India would be considered for index inclusion in the future. Besides, of course, as Rahul was mentioning, that India is also considering giving some capital gain tax exemption to foreign investors, which will essentially set up the road better for the euro player to speed up the inclusion of debt in global indices. We also have seen some progress with regard to extension of trading hours, flexibility around the pre-funding of margin accounts, but we still have large hurdles like market access, account opening, and ease of trading as far as the foreign investors is concerned, which still I think a lot of foreign investors are still lamenting about, that there's still a long way to go as far as these things are concerned. But nonetheless, I think RBI has been making a tremendous amount of progress, and there was a recent report by JP Morgan index team, which has now put India on the index watch. So any kind of India's inclusion in GBI EM index will essentially mean that probably you will see India being included in JP Morgan GBI index by probably mid of this year, next year itself, and most likely in the Bloomberg GAI probably by end of the year. One isn't very sure whether what is the deal with the FTSE index, but it may not necessarily be eligible, at least in the near term. So I think most global houses have given the numbers in the range of 35 to 40 billion as far as passive flows are concerned, which includes both JP Morgan as far as and Bloomberg index. So I think that itself would mean that at least there was some bit of a relaxation as far as flows are concerned. That will also imply that you will have an implied benefit with regard to the cost of funding overall. I think one good thing with regard to index inclusion is that since the channel is essentially relatively more passive in nature, you probably will not see very sudden reversal for an investor, because a large part of them are passive in nature. So that is what I think most of them are also mentioning in the past as well. I think in a broader term, if I really see that sovereign yield curve is perceived to be a public good in general, then the benefits of a fall in the primary level of funding cost will likely have benefit across the credit market as well, even though it may not be very symmetric. Of course, we've seen that in the past also. Whenever RBI has even put in liquidity in the system, it doesn't mean that across the credit curve you will see the symmetric gains happening. But nonetheless, I think it will at least start the process for lowering of your total cost of capital being much lower. And now this could, of course, lead to a more dynamic and liquid bond market as well over a medium term. And that essentially will imply that you will also have a better price discovery in the bond market, and that will also mean that it will act as a starting point for probably a more deeper corporate bond market as a consequence as well. But again, that is more of a visual thinking. I think more importantly, the added benefit of that will come in the form of a more accountable and a well-behaved sovereign. I think that is something that we as market participants have been asking the government of India, and it would imply that probably you will have a more well-behaved and a more well-channelized FRBM led fiscal consolidation over a medium term. I think one important thing that former Governor Reddy also had argued is that when you are increasing your dependence on foreign savings as far as sovereign is concerned, somewhere you have to adjust it by reducing your funding requirement from other avenues. So basically, if you're looking at the aggregate level of sustainable current account deficit 2%, which is seen as an acceptable level of or a sustainable level of current account deficit, I think what he essentially argued is that if sovereigns are borrowing a much higher percentage, it has to be it can only be seen as a substitute to some other form of foreign savings, say ECB borrowing. That has to sort of lower itself. So you can't necessarily just tap foreign borrowing to the extent that you probably lead to more a higher risk taking in general. But I think similarly, if the fiscal deficit is sort of predetermined, there would anyway be relatively more stable substitution of funding that will happen from foreign savings. So I think that bit still needs to be worked out in general. Another issue with regard to this has been with as to how it will really impact the FX market. As Madam Thorat was mentioning that India has restricted capital inflows in the past, so market for there has been sort of a market for trading Indian assets has developed parallelly in the foreign markets. So one such market, of course, is the NDF market, which allows buyers to buy forwards in Indian rupee without settling the transaction in Indian rupee. RBI had established a committee in 2019-20 to bridge the gap between onshore and offshore markets. Over time, the need of the hour obviously is that you cannot have both these market existing with inefficiencies. So with increased convertibility, what will happen is that this market will need to be linked somewhere or the other. In this regard, convertibility over the years, of course, has led to lower spreads between the two markets, which I think is a big positive. Of course, there's been also effort or a move towards commencing the interest derivative segment as well, but I think we still have a long way to go on that front. And also allowing access to Indian banks to the NDF market and increased trading hours are also sort of consistent with this objective. Of course, the RBI had to sort of go back on the increased trading hours into the pandemic. I think things will normalize probably over the coming months or so, wherein again banks would be probably trading 24/7 or so. So I think in overall, with regard to this, the spread between the onshore and the NDFs has substantially narrowed, and which obviously means that the volatility has come down, and this essentially will also imply that your domestic market becomes more deep. There's a proper mechanism of information flow that eventually will happen. Exchange and management is going to be better. interest rate management is going to be more effective in a situation of larger offshore transactions and a more transparent onshore offshore deal. And once they get integrated, it also will imply that they'll have a better price discovery in the system. I think within the domestic market, we also need a better price discovery, irrespective whether we have the NDF or not, because eventually, if that doesn't happen, the flows will eventually move to offshore segment. More importantly, you do see that we have over the past few years or so, we actually have seen a very, very tight bid-ask spread in the interbank market, which most large corporates, seem to have, benefit out of that because they have access to Reuters and the Bloomberg of the world. Yet a lot of entities like SMEs, small importers, individuals for that matter, are prone to overpricing because banks tend to have a huge margin and processing fees, since most of these guys don't have access to these fancy databases, and thus it has still led to very high interbanks pricing between banks and these players, which essentially led to, again, inefficient price discovery. So I think the RBI had made a move with regard to creating an effective retail forex user platform, but most banks have not really necessarily been pushing these, the smaller players or exposing them to these part of this segment, wherein they can also benefit from this tight spread. And eventually, I think it's just a matter of time that once, if you're talking about integration of onshore and offshore market well and proper efficient price mechanism, it's high time that it actually happens within the domestic market also before we really talk about a more bigger picture. And I think banks need to give a fair trial to that bit. And I think it, over time, it would eventually happen wherein, banks will probably have to make it more transparent to even smaller players. And of course, needless to say that they'll have to prepare themselves for any kind of volatility and change in the depth of the markets, wherein they will probably have to keep more buffers in hand. Even from a financial sector point of view, I think most countries in the world have also sort of tighter the liquidity coverage ratios, net stable funding ratios, which essentially are used to manage exposure to short-term flows. Similarly, they can also, define or probably state some kind of loan to value ratio, debt service to income ratios in order to avert any kind of credit or asset bubbles that may come along with the CAC. So in conclusion, I think we have come a long way with regard to achieving some level of convertibility in capital account, but as everybody's mentioned that we still have a longer way to go. And in terms of achieving a stable composition of foreign capital inflows, it is interesting that the Reserve Bank is moving ahead with a more trickier phase of liberalizing the capital inflows by using the debt market as a tool. I think the evolution of capital convertibility will only increase with these and such similar issues, similar measures over the medium term. And obviously, it will also be seen as an early step to internationalization of the rupee, which again will be probably a much more long-term process. So I think we'll see how things pan out, but I think we're clearly in a very interesting space at this point in time, and I hope that we don't mess around with things. That's it from mine. Thank you.
That was a rapid fire flow of thoughts and ideas, Madhvi. The efficient capital allocation has been a topic for continuous discussion, at least for the past 2.5 decades. You have highlighted that the global way to move towards a global bond index is the ideal way to get the sovereign debt penetration by the FIS. That's a very good point. And the better price discovery in the bond markets and the retail participation should aid in the helping that. And the reducing funding requirements from other revenues is also a point of highlight, which you said. And on the FX market, the onshore, offshore linkages and the bid-ask price reducing. So on the whole, lot of ideas. One thing I have seen in all the three economists converging on the views is that the funding of the current account deficit is through the FDI flows. And the more the things change, more they remain the same. We go back to the preconditions of the Tarapur Committee. So thank you very much for a very good presentation. Now over to Uday Bhaskar to handle the Q&A session. We have received some questions from the participants.
We'll be taking a few questions. Maybe because of the paucity of the time, we may not be able to take all the questions. There are around 6 to 7 questions are there. The first question is directed to Dr. Tirthankar. Dr. Tirthankar, just this is in conjunction with what the SMT Usha Thorat has told. This is regarding the global bond prices inclusion. and how we are going to sustain the GSEC yields. What is your reaction on this particular things? Are we going to have eternally the negative real yields if it is continuing like this, or the scenario is going to be changed? Can you please take this question?
Well, inflation, real yields are negative at this point, and one would hope that they don't remain so for a longish period. So the straight answer that I have for are we eternally going to have negative real yields is hopefully not. The answer is very clearly not. We are seeing some respite on inflation even now, and over the next few months, things remain dicey from a global perspective. But in India, one hopes that inflation numbers remain quite low. So I do not believe that we'll remain in this world of negative real yields for a long time.
Okay. What about the impact on the inclusion in the bond index and other things? What to see that is there going to be any large scale the way the yields will be moving, or is it lot of volatility will be there?
I think Madhavi answered that fairly well in her exposition. Madhavi, would you like to add? I mean, I think you did speak about the Bloomberg index, the JP Morgan index, and the FTSE index.
So yeah, I think most estimates are suggesting that you're probably going to be seeing roughly around, one-time flows of 32 billion, both, JPM and Bloomberg Barclays inclusive. I think obviously that would lead to a lower cost of capital in the beginning. Bond market was already cheering about it, but and there could be a chance that most likely say JPM announces its inclusion in the month of March, which will eventually happen say in June, where the passive fund flow actually comes. During that 3-month period, there could be a decent amount of trading or speculative trading that could lead to artificial adjustment in the yields, but may not necessarily sustain. And eventually, I think over the medium term, we have to still remember that FI is only one segment of the funding. A large funding still comes from the banking segment. Whether you like it or not, at this point in time, we're still struggling with any kind of credit offtake, and thus sustainable demand is still coming from the banking sector as far as funding of FISC is concerned. But clearly speaking, with the change in global liquidity and also RBI being a little uncomfortable with regard to its current stance, it's just a matter of time that the bear flattening of yield curve will actually sort of imply that across the curve you'll still see yield going up. So you may get some benefit of that with regard to yields falling. I think that is sort of priced in by the market, but I don't think it would lead to a dramatic change. And it's just a one-time adjustment that will happen, which again is a big number. But it will obviously come over a period of time. So India essentially would get say around 6% to maximum 10% weight in the GBI of Bloom, from where only this whole 35-40 billion number is coming. And I think that will again come in a very staggered fashion. So it's not that from June you'll suddenly start seeing a big chunk of 30-45 billion coming into the Indian sovereign space. So it will be a very staggered move, which essentially will imply that one, there could be some speculative trading that will happen in that interim period. Two, it may not necessarily change the dynamics immediately because the money is not coming in one go. And three, of course, there's a decent demand that is still coming from the banking segment because of lack of credit offtake. So that again will mean that the push and pull will somewhere imply, and given the fact that RBI is obviously on its way to change its stance, I personally believe that yield probably will not fall very dramatically. We may still see 610, 615 be the sort of a lower floor. I don't think that we're going to be seeing yields going down, at least in the medium term.
Okay, thank you. The next question is to Mr. Rahul. This as we see this capital account convertibility that is going to take out maximum outflows from the HNIs from here. Do you see any high volatility in the currency, and how far will we be able to stabilize the currency stability, which is the major RBI objective?
Yeah. So I would say the evidence of money flowing out of India in a say large amounts is actually very limited. Partly I think because of the legacy controls that are there in the banking system. So even on the LRS, it's not that easy to take money out. I know the paperwork is simplified, but it is still there is a reasonable amount of scrutiny. At the same time, I think that generally, when we look at it as a relative size of the economy, the amounts, absolute terms have been rising, but we haven't actually seen any major increase in the number of people who are, taking money out, or at least on a larger scale. And I know, like, the numbers, they like the media keeps talking about, oh, it's $7 billion or $10 billion, but they are actually very trivial in the bigger scheme of things, right? I mean, India is now a $3 trillion economy. It will be a $5 trillion economy whenever in 5, 6, 7 years. We have to be prepared for some amount of flexibility as far as say the number of Indians would be traveling outside, studying outside, living outside, and just being able to transact. So, is there any sense of say money being taken out for investments? Yes, I think perhaps back in a decade ago, when the enthusiasm about within the Indian industry was greater, right, about internationalization, we did see some large scale deals, say going through. So Tata Chorus would be one that would come to your mind. And but now it's become a lot more tactical, a lot more uh, strategic, right? So it's not like there's a very large scale outbound FDI as well, because that is something that does get approved very easily now, from an RBI standpoint. uh, so I would say the evidence is very mixed of money going out. What is likely to happen, though, I think, as more and more people are, they have the capacity, there could be a bit more, flow of capital. And some of that is already being reflected, say, through some of the new age instruments like cryptocurrencies and all. That is also a possible way of diversification. So I think what we see is effectively a need for diversification rather than, capital flight, which is traditionally what has been the fear within the system, when the exchange controls are designed.
Thank you, Mr. Rahul. I think now, because of the paucity of the time, we may not be able to take more questions. But on behalf of SYFX Treasury Foundation, I assure you that we'll have a sequel for this particular seminar, which will be where we'll be able to discuss at length about what is going to be the effect. Actually, the India is going to have the more effect on this particular this thing. We'll be discussing. Now, right now, let me move to the final portion of the thing. Vote of thanks. Good evening to all the participants of the webinar, and SYFX Treasury Foundation together with NSE wish happy Diwali to all the participants. And now, as far as the topic is concerned, this is has been dealt very effectively by the speakers. Before this one, just I would like to have some acknowledgement to the SYFX Treasury Foundation mentor. It's actually, as you know, SYFX Treasury Foundation, as a part of knowledge sharing, is conducting series of webinars on contemporary topics of great utility to the banking community in general and the Treasury fraternity in particular. This is possible because of the visionary mentorship of the foundation by Sri V. Samamurthy, and the foundation always owes a lot to him, and he is the driving force, and he's giving the ideas of how to move about the webinars and all. And the topic was deftly deliberated by the worthy speakers and opened many discussion points before further relaxations are introduced. I'm sure that the webinar will form a base for further elaborate deliberations in the coming days, and our foundation is sure to come before you with some more webinars on the same subject to emerge with more focused needs of various stakeholders. On behalf of SYFX Treasury Foundation, I profusely thank Srimati Usha Thorat for consenting to initiate the webinar with her opening remarks and sharing her vast knowledge on the subject. SYFX Treasury Foundation is deeply obliged for your kind gesture, Madam. And next is Mr. Rahul Bajoria, a Chief Economist of India of the Barclays Bank, who had deftly dealt the historical perspective and the international experience regarding the capital account convertibility. The foundation is thankful to him for deliberating the topic effectively. Dr. Tirthankar Patnaik, a chief economist of NSE, had dealt the subject matter in the context of India and the way forward. On behalf of SYFX Treasury Foundation, I thank Dr. Tirthankar for dealing the topic very deftly and discussing the challenges to India in the path of the capital account convertibility. Mrs. Madhavi Arora, lead economist of MK Global Finances, very aptly dealt with a likely impact of the banking sector way forward. SYFX Treasury Foundation thanks her for providing the useful perspectives to the banks. NSE is our long-standing and trusted partner in conducting many of the webinars successfully and sponsoring the events. On behalf of SYFX Treasury Foundation, I thank NSE for all the support rendered in conducting the webinar successfully. I thank Mr. Vivek of NSE for the technical help rendered to conduct this webinar successfully. I am sure that this topic will be further be deliberated and fine-tuned in the coming days, and your beloved SYFX Treasury Foundation will be coming before you shortly with a sequel to this webinar. Finally, on behalf of SYFX Treasury Foundation, I thank all the participants of the webinar for having encouraged us with their valuable presence. Should you have any query or feedback, please send the same on our email at contact@syfx.org. We'll come back with the possible explanation at the earliest. With this, SYFX Treasury Foundation, along with NSE, takes leave from all of you with a promise to come back to you soon with another relevant webinar. Namaste, and wish all the participants a happy Diwali. Thank you.